HuNI, and I think that's because we played AC/DC when we launched HuNI, and it was all downhill from there. Alrighty, so we're using the mouse to progress. I'm a humanities scholar. I'm going to talk a little bit about the humanities rather than HuNI to start with. And the thing about the humanities that's kind of good to know is that we like to meddle with people's assumptions about how the world works by proposing questions all the time. So yes, we're talking today about open data, but we're also going to talk about open data, or is the purpose to produce open data or data that produces openness? Thank you. That is the question. So as I speak, could you keep that in the back of your mind? Because that's really the question I want us to keep circling around as we kind of think about what it is that we're doing in this sector. Are we producing open data or data that produces openness? What's the purpose here? I come to this via the digital humanities. And digital humanities is something that a lot of people are very confused about. Hands up who is confused about the digital humanities. Yes. Thank you. There is no really clear definition of the digital humanities because, of course, it sits in the humanities, and our job is not to make things easy for you, it's to ask questions. So what is the digital humanities? I kind of answer this typically by thinking of the digital humanities in the form of a joke. How many digital humanities scholars does it take to change a light bulb? Hence the light bulb. And the answer is, hypothetically, 2. One to change the light bulb, and the other to tell you that you're not a real digital humanities scholar unless you made the light bulb yourself. So the point of that joke is to think about the digital humanities as being very practice-driven as a form of the humanities, and also very collaborative, which is a bit of a shift for the humanities. The humanities has that stereotype of being a lone wolf scholar kind of discipline. So try and think about the idea of the humanities in the digital humanities sphere being more collaborative and, in a sense, being questioning. You know, you're not a real digital humanities scholar unless you made it yourself, and being practice-driven. Okay, second time I'm going to ask the question. How many digital humanities scholars does it take to change a light bulb? Wrong. 1. Because we're a bit like that, contrary. But no humanities scholar, digital or otherwise, would ever trust a single light source. Okay. And what that tells you is that the digital humanities is also, in a sense, complex. It's interested in complexity, not the idea of the singular or singularity, the single solutions. It's not really particularly interested in fixity either. So it's interested in contingency rather than fixity. So practice-led, collaborative, complex, contingent. These are all values that are held by the humanities which carry over into the digital humanities. So there's aspects of the digital humanities that really do extend the broad mission of the humanities anyway. So I'm interested in a digital humanities perspective on the question of open data and what that might look like. So in that sense, it's not just what we do with data or do to data, but equally to ask, what does data do to us and with us? Okay. Putting the humanities, the human, back into that picture around open data. How might we use digital systems or work with digital systems as a way to amplify cognition? It's very important in the humanities as a scholarly discipline to think about that. But also to create the possibilities for connection. Connection being just the light bulb moment, how to make connections at the level of ideas, but also connection in terms of how we connect to other researchers and how we connect things together. How do we put worlds together as a series of connections, in a sense? So how do we do that in the humanities? Let's have a think about that. And this is a visualization I put together some time ago. On the outsides, so in the middle you see the famous gaping void visualizations of information and knowledge, and then I added the ones on the outside. So you get data on the left, and what I would consider humanities knowledge on the right. It's a very simplistic diagram in one sense, but it's also a diagram that's trying to drive towards the notion of humanities knowledge being inspired by complexity and being comfortable with complexity. What you see on the right is a non-hierarchical network. It's also a network in which the connections are varied. This is to take a poetic phrase, if we're aspiring to worlds in which we can live our lives variously, this is an encapsulation of that. Living life variously, or understanding the world as being made up of relationships that are various in nature. The thicknesses of the connections vary, the colour, the timbre, the viscosity of connection is different in each instance and should be described in that way. Okay. So this is, I think, a sense, getting back to that idea of the humanities being driven by a kind of level of comfort in complex spaces. It's also asking us to think through what actually is then a relation, what constitutes a connection, what is a connection, what counts as a connection in different cultures or communities, or within different cultures and communities, not just between them, but within them. What are the principles of connection or relationships for different people? What does it look like if we have relationships that pivot around difference rather than sameness? So those kinds of philosophical questions are all sitting buried in that visualization if you spend enough time thinking about it. What happens if the relationship draws entities together towards affinity? What happens when it pushes them apart towards difference? Or both? What if we did relationships that were capable of thinking of both those things at the same time? That would be very interesting. So, just to quickly summarise, the humanities are about contingency. Things are all relative. They're produced out of relationships. Complexity, which is different from being complicated. Complexity and complication are two different things. Contestability. What would happen if relationships were able to be asserted as not relationships? Okay. Philosophically, that's a very interesting problem. Philosophers over many centuries have debated this. Coexistence. How do we think about all these complex worlds living together within difference and with difference? And of course the final one, which is interpretation. It's the big one in the humanities. That everything is interpretable, depending on where you stand. So standpoint theory, for example, becomes very interesting. So if you want to look at that visualization, by the way, there's a link and you can download it. It's all in Figshare because open data. I do love this quotation from Édouard Glissant, which for me kind of summarises the humanities in some way. The fluctuating complexity of the world. This is a really fabulous way to think about the kinds of worlds that we live in, but not necessarily the kinds of worlds that we build as information managers. In fact, quite the opposite. We spend a lot of time reducing complexity, producing efficiency, rather than thinking about this. One of the expressions of that is the most recent, I guess, what can I call it? It's kind of like an intellectual meme or an organisational meme. FAIR. You're probably all familiar with FAIR. Findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. I have a few issues with FAIR. I think FAIR is really designed, particularly at the end there with reusable and interoperable, to think about the way in which data socialises. How do we get to data? How does data get to other data? How does data get to people? What are the social dimensions of data? For me, all interoperability is also about our assumed beliefs of intersectionality. How do we as societies interrelate and intersect? And if we understand that, then we can also start to think about how the way in which we interoperate data is deficient. My favourite example is, if you really applied the FAIR test to a data interoperation exercise, Robodebt would probably pass. So FAIR offers a social promise it can't keep. Right? It's somehow suggesting that the principles encapsulated in the acronym are socially fair, but they're not necessarily. Okay? What would make them something different? What would make them fairer? What would make fair fairer? An ethical dimension to the way we work with data. I'm aghast that wasn't included as a fundamental principle for FAIR. And this one, which I think is very controversial. What would happen if data was revisable? See, people already are sort of thinking that one through. It's a very, very controversial one. It's one I'd like to tease out and explore, not in 10 minutes today. But I'm parking it because I think it's really, really interesting. And it plays to this idea of contingency and elasticity and intersectionality. Okay. And to some extent, it's an extension of ethics. And you see the Europeans are trying to grapple with this through some of the laws and rules and regulations that are being developed there at the moment. FAIR is very popular. Those things on the right, your right, came from the eResearch Australasia conference last year, where you could actually go to a fairground and throw things at targets and do all sorts of stuff. They were really, really promoting FAIR. And it's been taken up in Europe as part of the open science. Science being an inclusive term in Europe, unlike here. So science incorporates the humanities in Europe. It really means research, whereas here it doesn't. It's an exclusive term. It was also taken up at the Digital Humanities Conference last year as well, but in a slightly different way. So the way in which the Digital Humanities is approaching things like FAIR, or the idea behind FAIR, is this thing called collections as data. And collections as data is a kind of emerging discipline within the digital humanities and also within library science and other kinds of areas. And one of the kind of key founders of this movement is a guy called Thomas Padilla. And he talks about how libraries support individuals working through many facets of complexity. There's that word again. So this is a much more digital humanities take on FAIR. Libraries support individuals working through the many facets of complexity that constitute the human condition. I'd like to flip that and say individuals might actually help libraries work through complexity, because I think we can. And I think that we can do both. So collections as data comes out of the Library of Congress in the US and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. You can look it up. There's lots of information. They are an open data initiative, so pretty much everything they've ever thought or eaten is publicly available. And I think this is a kind of really interesting movement for revisioning some of the things that we think about open data. Because what they're doing is, rather than the FAIR principles, they're emphasising these values, which I think are really, really interesting. Generativity, legibility, and creativity. So none of these things are about efficiency. They're very themselves quite generative and creative concepts and complex concepts. And they really play to that E that I adopted in FAIRer, the ethical dimension that I think FAIR needs to address. So I'm pointing you in this direction. Again, I don't have time to dwell on it because I've only got 3 minutes left. But this is a kind of very interesting and I think quite creative space that we could start thinking through. All right, so the main thing I want to talk about in relation to an example of this collections as data approach to openness and producing openness rather than open data itself being the endpoint is something called HuNI. HuNI is a virtual laboratory. It was funded by Nectar, hence its name, HuNI. Thank you. Yes. HuNI was an initiative of 16 different institutions working over a 3-year period. It's still occasionally being tweaked and developed. And it was designed to not just interoperate data from different collections that previously hadn't been able to talk to each other, but to enable researchers to engage with that data differently. How? How does HuNI do that? And we spent quite a lot of time thinking about how humanities researchers like to research. And the first thing to know about that is humanities researchers don't always find efficiency to be the best method for achieving discovery. Serendipity, meandering, getting lost in data, dwelling in data, they're often the things that are most valuable about the research process for humanities researchers. Sometimes they just want efficiency, find me the Australian Dictionary biography entry on Henry Murdoch, which I did today. Boom, there it is. Great. But if I really wanted to investigate and research that Aboriginal actor of 1940s and 50s Australian cinema, I may want to spend time just sitting inside some documentation and thinking about the connections between that actor and other actors at the time. So just really quickly, it's a VL. It's got about 30 different data sources. There's about 18 million entities in there at the moment. It's multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. And most importantly, the functionality that really distinguishes HuNI from most other virtual laboratories in this space, the users themselves, the researchers, can create, in their own words, the relationships between entity records inside HuNI and preserve them and share them. And they can do that over and over again, and they can contest other people's beliefs about those relationships. Okay? So, we get complexity, we get contestability, very important because humanities scholars drive towards discovery through processes of contestation. Okay? We get contingency, we get coexistence, and we get interpretation. Because if someone has asserted a relationship and another person asserts a different relationship, a third person can come along and interpret which relationship is the one that works for them. So you can discover, you can make connections, you can save and share, and you can curate and import your own data. Okay, this is what a scientist did inside HuNI. They created a collection. This is about the Maralinga blast. They broke HuNI doing this because we didn't anticipate that anyone would want to do this, because we were thinking like humanities researchers who tend to think like this. Okay? Where following trails of relationships is very important. Now this led us to a massive discovery of our own. It actually became an exemplification of how humanities scholars work. So the collection on the left, which is on Australian fashion 1850 to 1950, was linked by the researchers themselves to a collection that I made on Ken G. Hall. And I was demonstrating HuNI one day to someone, and as I was demonstrating it and following the links, I came across my own collection, serendipitously. And we discovered that HuNI, in fact, was a serendipity engine using crowdsourcing. So each of those lines, if you clicked on them, would open up into an argument. This is related to this because using vernacular language, not a structured vocabulary. Okay? The researcher writes the link in their own words. And they can use whatever words they like. They can be judgmental. They can say, Ken Hall was the worst director ever of this particular film, which was made 4 times by much better directors. You could say that. And another person could come along and completely contest that relationship. So it opens humanities researchers to ephemeral, expressive connections, different perspectives, dialogue, sharing, using links to give meaning and value, building ontologies from below, not waiting for them to arrive from above, godlike, in some 19th century colonial kind of way. It doesn't propose that there is a one-size-fits-all world. Imagine what we could do with this. Imagine if communities could generate their own cosmologies, their own ontologies, and have those sitting alongside other people's views of the world. Wow, that would be a world of coexistence. That would be a world where we don't build walls between Mexico and America, where we don't put children on concentration camps off the coast of Australia. That would be an amazing world. We could do that. In fact, we did. Anyone can do this. Right? So why do we cling to the idea that doing things one way is the best way? We call this socially linked data or vernacular ontologies. There's different ways of describing it. And we see this as being particularly about the open, not because it's about linked open data, which it is. Okay? It's a variation of linked open data. This is Paul Walk's definition. It's not just linked open data, it's truly open linked open data. Okay? And that's the openness that requires us to also be open. It produces an openness in the researchers to share and to open themselves to being challenged. And to understanding that the world is contingent and complex. and that we don't just have one view of it. I'm kind of interested in other ways that this happens in Australia. I'm just concluding now. And I think, like, I don't want to criticise linked open data. I think linked open data is taking people to part of the way to a view of openness, all right? And that is in the sense that, if we move beyond Mark and start to think about other ways of working with digital cataloguing systems that are able to be shared and interoperated, that's one step towards knowing that you're in a world that exists beyond your boundaries. But unfortunately, the way we're currently doing that, I think, is still reductive. And there are ways we can still move beyond that. Okay, so don't get me wrong, this is not a wholesale dismissal of linked open data. I see what HuNI's doing as an extension of linked open data and just taking it kind of in a further experimental step. I'm really fascinated by this event that occurred in the Northern Territory, where the Galawinku Library closed the Dewey Decimal System down and replaced the cataloguing system with one that made more sense to their community. Brilliant. Okay. Why can't that and Dewey and every other kind of way of thinking about how to navigate information sit side by side or overlapping in elastic ways that we can't even imagine? What might we learn from that about different ways of thinking about the world? And one last slide, or second last slide, which is a slide about something that's a book that I was looking at the other day. And what the authors of the book have done is they've put the book up online in draft form for peer review to the entire world. Okay, and it's a book on data and feminism. And they've put up a page of what they call their values metrics. And so they're using data to evaluate their performance against their own aspirations. So what they've done they've identified a structural problem that they would like their book to avoid, if possible. In the middle, they've put the metrics by which they want to measure their performance in relation to that aspiration. And then they've put what actually happened when they wrote the book. And they're asking the community to help them meet their metrics. Okay? I love this. It's really inspiring as an academic or a scholar. Making yourself accountable to data, opening yourself in the face of data. This is about using data to produce openness, right? It's not just about making data open, it's also about the way in which we use data and the way data has an impact on us. So they're now enabling that measurable to change them by being accountable to it. Not just being countable, but also being accountable. Super important. So I'm just going to finish up with my favourite slide from Jeanette Winterson. We don't build our bridges simply to avoid walking on water. Why are we building bridges in the world? Why do we make connections? Why do we want our data to be open? Why do we want to open ourselves? Right? These are much more important questions, and they're about understanding that the political, the technical, the social, the organisational, the personal, the institutional, all have a part to play in how we understand the data we work with, but also what we can do with data. But we have to think about it in relation to all those dimensions. It's not just about infrastructure. Okay. It's about a whole bunch of other aspects of lived contemporary life, and we're in that. And we have to think about ourselves in that. And something like HuNI shows you how imbricated you are in worlds of open data. And I think I'll end there.